Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Patrick Forscher. He is Assistant Professor of Psychology at the J. William Fulbright College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Arkansas. He studies social disparities and what to do about them. He also has a strong interest in research methods in psychology. Okay, so Dr. Forscher, thank you a lot for taking the time to come on the show.
Oh, thanks for the invitation.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Okay, so let's see. One of the big topics of your work is implicit biases. So, could you explain us briefly what are implicit biases about? Because it seems that it implies that then we also have explicit biases, and sometimes when people think about biases, they tend to perhaps join them all together and think that perhaps we only have biases of one type or another. So if you could do that for us.
Sure. Yeah, the basic idea behind implicit bias is that there are certain things happening inside one's head that people aren't completely aware of, and that those can influence your behavior. Um, and often these are talked about in the context of how you treat people of members of different groups, but the concept has been applied to a lot of other types of behavior too. And the whole big idea behind it is you have mental processes, you're not aware of them, and they influence your behavior.
Yes, so what's the big difference there between implicit biases and explicit biases? Is it that in the second case people are aware of the biases or not?
Yeah, so some people focus on that awareness part of it. There's there's a debate about how to define these things because if you define implicit biases based on awareness, I mean that can cover a lot of different kinds of behavior. That can cover wide range of mental processes too. Awareness is one of the things that people often focus on. So they make the distinction between the processes that you're aware of and the processes that you aren't, and the stuff that you're not aware of gets lumped into the implicit bias bucket, and the stuff that you are aware of gets lumped into the explicit bias bucket. But there's also a component of how automatic the processes are. Certain processes you are easier to control, certain processes are less easy to control. The processes that are less easy to control are sometimes lumped into the implicit bias bucket. Yeah, there is a bit of debate about how to draw these distinctions, or even how useful it is to draw the distinctions. Usually implicit bias is considered the stuff that is people are less aware of and or that is less controllable.
And what is the relationship between biases, being them implicit or explicit, and behavior? I mean, is it the case that if we have a bias, then that directly causes a behavior, or sometimes we have biases that perhaps we can have some control over them?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think it's useful to make a distinction between the mental processes that lead to a behavior and the behavior itself. I often, when especially in media accounts or in op-eds, for example, where people are trying to draw this concept of implicit bias, they label certain types of behavior themselves as implicit bias. I think as a psychologist, psychologists typically like to distinguish between the thing that you observe, the behavior that you're trying to explain, and the mental processes that might lead to it. Because the fact is that if you see any one behavior, it's hard to know what exactly is causing it. Like you don't have, no one has telepathy. You can't look into someone's mind and see, oh, these are exactly the causes of this thing that I'm seeing. That's not the way the world works. So I think it's useful to make that distinction between what you see, the behavior that you want to explain, and the processes that lead to it. That's not I'm not sure that that's a typical position, especially if you look at things like the in Starbucks that got a lot of play in the United States anyway. Um, so a manager of Starbucks called the police on some black customers, and a lot of people were pointing to this and saying, "Oh, it's an example of implicit bias, and why we need to do something about it." The fact is that we don't know. We usually don't know when we look at one instance of behavior and we're trying to explain what caused it. That's a really, really hard problem, and usually the only way we figure out something about cause is we look at a bunch of different instances we construct a scenario, and that's designed to test what the causes are. So anyway, that's a roundabout way of saying, yeah, I do think it's useful to make this distinction between the behavior that you observe and the processes that you think lead to it, because in everyday life, we usually don't know what causes what.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but I mean, if we are trying to study unconscious biases, even to know what they are about, we have to have an approach of getting to them indirectly through studying people's behavior, how they react to certain cues, perhaps, or how they behave towards certain groups of people and things like that. Or, at the very least, I would say to have imagiological studies, that is fMRI and things like that, to see if there are certain areas of the brain that are correlated with certain perhaps thoughts that people have when they are primed with certain stuff, like for example images from other people, from different races and different groups of people and things like that. I mean, perhaps what I want to ask you is that to have access to people's unconscious biases, we have to have this indirect approach of studying how they affect their behavior, right?
Well, okay. Implicit bias is one of the reasons that the discussion around it gets so complicated and I think sometimes confused is that people end up referring to implicit bias for multiple reasons. So there's one reason to try to understand implicit bias is a scientific reason, because we're interested in what causes people to behave in certain ways, and implicit bias might be a useful scientific tool for understanding behavior. So that's one reason. A separate reason is a moral reason. So some people have a strong moral feeling that unconscious bias is wrong, and it's something that they want to address. That's different from the degree, but it could be one reason to use this concept of implicit bias and to use it as an analytical tool. Another separate reason might be a public policy reason. So from the public policy standpoint, if, say, a policymaker is interested in reducing the number of unarmed black men that get shot by police, they might think, well, one of the reasons for that might be implicit bias. And so if I can find some public policy levers that reduce implicit bias or mitigate its effects, that might allow me to get to the public policy outcome that I'm interested in. So all separate reasons. And the scientific conversation, I think, is sort of separate from the other two types of conversations that I was talking about. And I think even what scientists call implicit bias in that scientific conversation looks pretty different from what the policymakers are calling implicit bias and what the people who are interested in that moral case are calling implicit bias. And also the understandings of what it means for implicit bias to influence behavior are different in each of those different conversations. So I think that's partly why this whole discussion gets so mixed up, because people are talking at cross purposes. The scientists are over here talking about implicit bias, which looks very different from what the activists and policymakers are calling implicit bias. And also the aims are different. You know, the scientists are interested in developing this understanding of the human mind and how the human mind is related to behavior, how it produces behavior. But that's not really the goals of the activists or the policymakers. That's sort of beside the point. And you mix it all up on, you know, op-eds and so on, and it just looks very confused, and it's difficult for someone who's outside of the scientific world and the activist world and the public policy world to like understand what the heck is going on.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so would you like to tell us perhaps what are some of the main types of implicit biases that you study and that you think have the biggest effects in terms of people's behavior, and perhaps due to that also have the biggest impact on society, perhaps?
Okay, so I think I'm a bit of a weirdo in the scientific world in that I am a little bit skeptical that implicit bias is important at all for influencing behavior. It could be, but I don't think that I think that the evidence is not strong that it is. So I guess my answer would be, I don't know. I'm not sure that any form of implicit bias is important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very well. And that's very interesting, your answer, because I mean, even recently, things like the implicit bias association test has been questioned by several people. They question mainly its validity and perhaps its prediction power or something like that. So would you like perhaps to talk a little bit about that as well?
Sure. So my issues with implicit bias as a concept are separate from some people's issues with the implicit association test, or IAT, that you were describing. I think the IAT is a perfectly fine tool. Sure, it has its flaws. Any measure used by psychologists does have its flaws. My issue with the concept of implicit bias, first of all, I don't necessarily have an issue with the concept. That's not exactly the right way to put it. I'm just not sure that it's an important thing for policymakers to be talking about, for example, because I'm not sure that it has a strong influence on behavior that is important for policy. And that position comes from a pretty big project that is still somewhat ongoing that I did with a bunch of different collaborators, including Calvin Lai. He was a lead on this project, where we looked at every study that we can find where people did some sort of manipulation to try to change implicit bias. And if implicit bias I did have a causal relationship with people's behavior, you'd expect that if you change it, that the behavior would change as well. And what we found was there are a bunch of different procedures that do change people's measured implicit bias, but their behavior doesn't change in a consistent way with the change in implicit bias, which is what you'd expect if there was this causal relationship. Now, you know, there are a lot of different caveats. So if you look across the studies that people have conducted, something like only 6% have a measurement that of implicit bias and or behavior 24 hours or more after the manipulation. And if you wanted these ways of changing implicit bias to be used in public policy contexts, for example, well, you would hope that people would be like studying whether the changes that these things produce would have any sort of would last at all. And that's not what people are doing. Also, the kinds of behaviors that people investigate are really trivial, in my opinion. So there are things like how close a person chooses to sit next to a confederate of the experimenter. So the experimenter recruits a black person, has them like sit in a hallway, and the measurement, the behavior that they're examining, these people are examining, is whether the participant chooses to sit really close to the confederate or far away. And that's supposed to be an indicator of racial bias. And yeah, I mean, maybe that's important, but it's pretty far removed from something like a shooting of an unarmed black man. I mean, there's just no comparison between those behaviors. And yet, in a lot of the public conversation about implicit bias, that's the kind of thing that people want to apply that concept to is shootings or the medical care that black people receive. And those are really far removed from each other. So that's an inference problem. It's a problem of generalizing a concept from one thing to another. It's unclear that you can make that leap. But even like, if you just say, okay, this is what we've got in the studies that we've conducted, and the types of behavior that are examined in these studies are maybe far removed from the generalizations that we want to make. And I would characterize them as kind of trivial. So even if you say that, there isn't much evidence that changing implicit bias leads to a change in those kinds of behaviors that are, I would characterize as trivial. And I think that's pretty damning. Now, it's also true that like I could be proven wrong. Like I think the standard of the research standard, the rigor of the studies that we have right now is not high enough. But maybe with more rigorous studies, we'd find something different. Maybe we'd get more evidence of change. But my perspective is we're not there yet, and that's why I think this implicit bias, this concept, might not be a concept to be applied to areas of public policy, and it might not even necessarily be that important scientifically. Although I think that's probably not true. It's probably still worth scientists using this concept, but bringing it to public policy, no, I think we're nowhere near the point where we can do that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so if at least at this point in time there's no proven causal relationship between implicit bias and, in this case, discriminatory behavior, let's say, what about stereotypes and prejudices? I mean, people also talk a lot about how stereotypes and prejudices affect people's behavior toward people from groups they discriminate against. So what would you have to say about that?
Okay, so that's an area that's entirely separate from implicit bias. Implicit bias, as I mentioned before, is this idea that there are mental processes that are somewhat automatic that people aren't aware of, and that have an influence on people's behavior. And that's the concept that I'm taking issue with. Or to be more precise, what I take issue with is how much of an influence they have on people's behavior and whether that influence is an important policy matter, an important pragmatic matter. Because there probably is some sort of influence, but maybe it's just not an important one. Stereotypes and prejudice are different. So stereotypes, to a social scientist like me, the stereotypes are the ideas that people have about social groups. So women are caring. That's an idea about the social group of women. And a prejudice that's usually social scientists think of that as the feelings that people have about social groups. So whether you feel warmly or coldly towards the group of women or men or whatever the group is, those undoubtedly have an influence on people's behavior towards those social groups. I mean, it's almost going to be trivially true that if you think women are caring, or if you have that caring, that what sorts of occupations you think women are going to go into. But like that's not a radical thing for me to say. Like the thoughts that people have about social groups or food or what you name the object, those thoughts are going to have an influence on people's behavior towards members of that social group or whatever the object is. that's trivially true. So it's not even necessarily an interesting thing for me to say that your thoughts about members of a particular social group, the stereotypes, are going to influence my behavior towards members of those social groups. Like, yeah, of course.
Yes, but I would also like to ask you a little bit more about how we study stereotypes and prejudice. Because, I mean, I've also want to ask you about this because I've been having quite a lot of evolutionary psychologists on the show, and with a few of them I talked a little bit about this. And is there any possibility that perhaps the beliefs that sometimes people express as being the causes of their behavior. I mean, sometimes people say, "Oh, I hold this belief about that particular group of people," and then we conclude that it is because that particular person holds that belief that then she acts in a certain way toward that group of people. But could it be the case that at least sometimes what people say are the beliefs that they hold about certain groups of people are not really what causes the behavior, and perhaps sometimes it is even just people rationalizing their behavior after the fact?
Sure, yeah. So you could reasonably ask the question, if you have a behavior that you care about explaining, so it could be, discrimination or whatever. How much of that behavior can you explain using their beliefs, and how much of it is due to other things? And are people's apparent beliefs consistent with the behavior, or is it sort of an epiphenomenon, something that people rationalize after the fact? And I bring that back to the idea of implicit bias. That is one of the reasons I think why the idea of implicit bias is so interesting to a lot of people, because the whole idea behind implicit bias is that, you may think that you're a fair-minded person, but really, if you look at this cognitive test that I give you, look at the things that you're saying are completely different from the results of this cognitive test. And for many, that is counterintuitive and sometimes disturbing and really interesting and whatever. I think, so I'm a social psychologist. I think social psychologists have been really captivated by that idea, that people's what people do is really different from what people say they will do, and what people's expressed beliefs. And that probably is true, that there, to some extent, that there are some differences between what people do and what people say they will do. But to bring up a kind of a new topic that's very important to me, so psychology and social psychology in general have been going through a reevaluation of a lot of our past studies. I think the fact that the fact that we can show you, hey, there's this cognitive test that's so different from what you're actually doing, the fact that that's so media friendly and appealing, I think has led to an incentive to create these studies where you show this really important difference between what people do and what people say they will do. But it seems like a lot of those may not be true, or at least that's my opinion. A lot of those disparities between what people do and what people say they will do. So I'm just a little bit skeptical of that whole line of reasoning, that there's this big difference between what people do and what people say they will do. I'm not sure how much of that is actually true. It probably is true to some extent. Whether it's true in general, I guess I'm skeptical.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but could it be the case that perhaps through some processes of coalitional psychology, people create a group identity, and perhaps then, because if they were to behave in a certain way toward people from outgroups or a particular outgroup, let's say, it would benefit them and also their group, and so they decide to behave in a certain way in regards to those self-interests, and then only after the fact do they elaborate something in their heads to justify why they behave wrongly toward that group of
Yeah, but I think a lot of the time people are aware that they're doing that. Get a group of U.S. Democrats and U.S. Republicans, and a lot of people will tell you, I don't want anything to do with Republicans, or I don't want anything to do with Democrats. Some percentage of the time they might not be aware that they're doing it, but I think people are correct about their perceptions of their behavior more than social psychologists anyway have portrayed.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I don't know. I think it's very clear that Democrats and Republicans, especially right now, hate each other and are perfectly aware of that feeling of dislike. And their preference for people of the same political affiliation. That might not be true of all groups. That is an empirical question, but I guess I'm very skeptical of that claim that a lot of what we do we're just not aware of. I think that's one of the types of claims that has not survived well in this, you could call it a reproducibility crisis in psychology. So it may be true, but I think it's less true than what we once thought, maybe go back 20 years in psychology.
Mm-hmm. Okay, fair enough. And what would you say are some of the scientifically backed approaches, if there are any, of course, or at least some validated ones, to change how people think about groups of people that they usually discriminate against, through stereotypes and prejudice and things like that, of course?
So I think one of the better ones is having cross-group contact. It has to be contact on an equal footing, ideally with a common goal. Norms is another one. Norms are the rules that are present in a certain environment. To give you an example, like if I'm going to have a Skype meeting, I know that it would be weird if I showed up not wearing clothing. I know that through norms, or that's one of the ways I know that. And it's people are often aware of the norms that are in a certain environment. They certainly have a powerful influence over what we do. There's a researcher named Betsy Paluck, who, for example, found that norms changed in the wake of the U.S. Supreme Court decision permitting gay marriage. And that's one area where I think in the United States, at least, we've seen really dramatic changes in people's attitudes and behaviors about gay couples. So that's a compelling demonstration of the power of that idea of norms. So I'd say those are two big ones that seem to have some good evidence behind them.
Mm-hmm. And simply informing people about the fact that they have certain biases and what those biases are about, does that help in any way?
No, that's not enough. So I think, okay, so there are a couple layers to that question. One is that idea that informing people that they have a bias, that is, there's a presumption there that most of the why people are biased is due to these unconscious processes that they're not aware of. And as I was just saying, I personally have some skepticism about whether that's actually true. But if it is, to the extent that it is true, just informing people about their biases still won't be enough, because the whole idea behind like implicit bias is that there's some level of automaticity to the behavior as well. So it's not enough that you inform people about a bias that they have. You also have to give them some way to interrupt it, and the person has to actually get up and do that thing. So awareness would be one part of it. Two others that I'd say are important are motivation. So someone has to actually want to address the problem, and then effort. They have to get up and do the thing that might interrupt the influence of that process.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but I mean, it's not easy. It's not simply people being aware that they have a bias, and because they perhaps are motivated to become better people and to not let that bias affect their behavior toward other people. That's not enough, because I mean there's even the phenomenon of bias blind spot, that is people that just because they think that they are aware of their own biases, then they believe that they no longer affect their behavior, right?
Yeah, so you can draw a parallel to like trying to a clinician trying to get a depressed client to do something about the depression. One of the reasons that depression can be so debilitating is that it can be hard to tell that you're depressed while you are. You sort of become accustomed to a new normal where everything just looks a little bit dull. But also depression saps your motivation to do anything about it. So there's a concept in clinical psychology called motivational interviewing, which the whole idea is to try to first get someone to the point where they recognize that there's things could be better. Then you try to remove some of the barriers to getting that person to do something about their depression or whatever the problem might be. You're sort of moving people through certain stages of change. While in a similar way, getting someone to do something to address a bias that they might have, a social bias, could be thought of as a form of motivational interviewing. You're trying to get people aware that there might be an issue that they might want to work on, motivated to do something about it, and then you give them some tools to actually do the thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you've already alluded a little bit to this, but I would like to ask you a little bit more about that. That is, you talked about a bit about the replicability or the replication crisis, particularly in psychology. And I know that you are very interested in the science reform movement, and you're involved in some of its initiatives. So could you tell us more first about what is the science reform movement, and perhaps then some initiatives you're involved in that you would like for people to know a little bit more about?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I was in graduate school, I think I was in my second year, I received a paper over my email where a very famous psychologist that I'd actually read quite a bit of his work as part of my graduate training. I had published a paper in the top journal in my field showing that ESP was real. And I received that paper over email, and I was like, what the fuck? Something really weird is happening here.
Oh, by the way, could you just tell people what is ESP, because some people might not be aware?
The title of the paper was Feeling the Future, and the idea was that people had some sort of sense. They could recognize future events before they happened. Their feelings allowed them to see into the future and change their behavior on the basis of being able to see into the future. That's fucking crazy. So I saw that paper, I read it, and the weirdest thing about getting this paper and sort of reading the preprint before it showed up in print was that I couldn't identify any flaws in it. Like it just seemed like a normal paper that I would read, just every day as part of my graduate training. And yet the conclusion I was reaching just couldn't possibly be true. Like there's no way that ESP is true unless there's something fundamentally flawed about our view of physics. I'm not a physicist, so I can't know that for sure, but I think there's a greater likelihood that there was something weird about this paper than that the whole physics community is wrong. I just was taking that as a given. So it took a while for us to figure out what was probably wrong about that ESP paper. The author of that paper, by the way, is Daryl Bem. He's a very famous social psychologist. He has a long storied history of contributions to a lot of different areas. I mean, now I guess I sort of wonder how much of that other stuff is true too. But anyway, he wasn't just some this wasn't a fly-by-night operation. Daryl Bem was a well-respected figure in the field, and still is, I think. And he was also at a top university, Cornell, and like I said, was the top journal of our field. So what was probably happening there is that basically the usual ways that social psychologists, and maybe psychologists in general, maybe a lot of other scientists too, the usual ways that we do our science have some real flaws in them. And a lot of the science reform movement, a lot of what we're trying to do with this movement is figure out what those flaws are and then try to build in some ways to fix those flaws to make sure that our science is better. This realization that the normal ways that we are doing science it's a lot of why I view my field, social psychology, with some skepticism. I think social psychology is populated by a lot of interesting ideas that maybe are true. I just don't know which ideas are true. I don't know. I can't point to you with as much certainty as I used to be able to say yeah, that's probably true, or no, this probably isn't true. We're starting to gather evidence about which of the ideas are more likely to be true. And that's, in some ways it's kind of an exciting time to be a social psychologist, but it can be really frustrating to read a paper from 20 to 30 years ago and to say, well, I can't tell if this is credible anymore. That sucks. That really sucks. So I spend a lot of my time working on the reform movement so that I can be a little bit more confident going forward if I read a paper that this has more. I can view this evidence as credible. I can be more confident that it was true than before I read the paper.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so what would you say are some of the main faults in the way we do science nowadays? Just to give an example, would you say that fraud could be one of them? That is, for example, is it that nowadays perhaps scientists and academics are put through a lot of pressure and stress, and perhaps that at least to some extent promotes fraud on their side, and what else?
The fundamental reason, I think, why there are flaws with the current way of doing science is that what is incentivized in science is publishable papers. But the things that make something publishable aren't the same as the things that make things true. The things that make something publishable are bold, sexy claims that are novel, And ideally, you want to spend as few resources as possible per each publishable paper. So you want to maximize the papers that you get for your financial investments or your investments of time. Well, if you're spending less resources to validate a claim, that's going to have a cost in terms of it's that paper's quality as evidence. So that I'd say is the fundamental problem. Now, there are a lot of different manifestations of that problem. To give you an example, the more, in general, the more observations you have of a thing, the more certain you can be that those observations reflect reality. So if you have, like, let's say you're working on an experiment where you have two groups of people, you show one group of people one type of picture, another group of people another type of picture, and then you measure their attitudes afterwards. So if you have 20 people per group, the estimate that you get of the difference in attitude in those two groups is going to be pretty noisy. It's if you repeat that experiment over and over again, you're going to get pretty different estimates of that mean difference each time you run the experiment. Whereas if you did that same experiment with, say, 1,000 people per group, and you do that experiment over and over again, you're going to get a pretty similar estimate of that difference in attitude each time you run the experiment. So it seems just true that if you have an experiment with 1,000 people per group, that serves as much higher quality evidence than that experiment with 20 people per group. So in general, the more observations you have in an experiment, the better that study will serve as evidence. But there's an incentive to skimp because, like I said, the less resources you spend per study, the better it looks in terms of your productivity, and the more accolades you'll get, the more success you'll get as a scientist. So that's one of those perverse incentives. There's an incentive to skimp on resources, to invest as few resources as possible to get publications. And yet, what's best for science is maybe spending a bit more time and a few more resources on an experiment. So that's one source. Another source is that especially in an area like psychology or social psychology, the things that we're interested in studying, like implicit bias or attitudes, or a lot of these concepts are really mushy and ambiguous, and it can be hard to know exactly how to measure them or even how to define them. So maybe what you do if you're designing a study where you're interested in attitudes is you include, say, 5 measures of the same thing, because you don't know ahead of time like which one is the right one. But then after you run your study, it can be really tempting to select the measure that gave you the results that are most consistent with what you think is happening, and just present those. And yet, if you use 5 measures, chances are one of those measures will have results that are consistent with your theory just because of noise, just because of random chance. So what you end up with is this beautiful looking study where everything worked out consistent with your theory, except that just happened by chance because you used 5 measures instead of 1. So that's another source of, these are often called researcher degrees of freedom. They're little things you can tweak about. There are areas in your experiment where it's a little bit ambiguous what the right decision is, but it can be really tempting, and you can find yourself exploiting those researcher degrees of freedom to make your theory look better. So what the science reform movement is trying to do is, or one of the things that's trying to do, is figure out where these researcher degrees of freedom are, and then figure out ways to constrain those researcher degrees of freedom so that when we look at a study, we can look at it and think that the evidence is credible. So one of the best ways to do that, one of the ways that seems to be most successful at constraining research degrees of freedom, is something called pre-registration. The whole idea is you just lay out in advance what you're taking to be your primary measure and how you're going to analyze it. Because if you say in advance, oh, well, the Jones attitude scale is the thing that I think is the best measure of attitudes, and then it turns out that the Jones attitude scale didn't show the effect that you want. If you've laid that out in advance, that constrains you, and you're better able to say, oh yeah, when I started the study, I really did think that the Jones attitude scale was the best attitude scale. So I'm not going to use these other attitude scales that I included in my study as, ways to show that my theory worked out, because that's not what I thought before I saw my results. So one other question that you'd asked is what's happening intentional fraud? I think in most cases, no. So there have been a couple high-profile cases of fraud, like there was a researcher named Diederik Stapel, another social psychologist from the Netherlands. And it turned out that he had been committing fraud for since his dissertation, I think, for a really long time. And there was a big scandal about Diederik Stapel and how could it be that this guy was committing fraud and nobody noticed? I think in most cases, when the quality of evidence is undermined, it's not due to fraud. It might be due to the career incentives. People want to advance their career, and so they convince themselves that they predicted everything in advance. Although I still think it's, in cases like Diederik Stapel, it is shocking that nobody noticed that the fraud was occurring, even though there seemed to be, if you looked closely at the papers, there might have been tells that something weird was happening, but that, it was never caught. So I think that's a problem, and it's worth addressing. I think in most cases, though, most researchers are not committing fraud.
Mm-hmm. Good. Okay, so perhaps just one last question, and again about this replicability crisis, but now toward another topic that is more about the theoretical foundations of certain disciplines. And since our conversation today has been focusing on social psychology in this case, I would like to ask you if you think that perhaps, and this, I guess, could be generalized to most social science, I would say, that perhaps one of the issues and another reason why perhaps there's this replicability crisis and it is very visible in psychology specifically, it could be because it should be more grounded in biology and biological processes. So perhaps when we're studying people's behavior at the individual and the collective level and how people interact with each other, perhaps through the last several decades there has been a lot of work that has not really been very grounded in things like neuroscience and evolution and other biological aspects. So do you agree with this or not?
I'm of mixed minds. So I think it is certainly true that, and I'll just speak to social psychology here, I think it's certainly true that the scientific theories in social psychology are often a little bit fuzzy and non-specific. And the reason that's a problem, the reason that could contribute to the replicability crisis is that if you get a result that is inconsistent with your theory, if you're not able to even say what the theory is, it can be very easy to say, well, actually there's this exception to the theory, and here's why this result doesn't bear on the theory. If the theories are hard to pin down, they're difficult to impossible to falsify. And that's a real issue. However, the reason I don't fully agree that the reasons for the replicability crisis are a lack of grounding in biology is that biology has a replicability crisis too. There's there's actually a project that's spearheaded by the Center for Open Science to try to test the replicability of cancer biology. And one of the findings of that project so far is that it's difficult even to get to the step of replicating cancer biology experiments because the methods are so nonspecific about how to go about doing that replication. That's a real problem. There's also a replicability crisis in medicine. It seems like there are some replicability problems in fMRI research because it's really expensive to get people into the scanner to do the imaging of the brain. That means that there's an incentive to not run so many participants through the scanner, which leads to that problem of noise. The fact that if you did the same study over again, if your sample is small enough that your results might be bouncing around, and that can undermine the credibility of the evidence. So this isn't just a problem in psychology. I think part of the reason why there's been so much activity in addressing the replicability crisis in social psychology in particular goes back to that paper by Daryl Ben, that the one that seemed to show that people could look into the future. That ended up setting off a lot of self-examination. Then also, I mentioned Dietrich Stoppel, the person who committed a lot of fraud. That also spurred people to think, like, what's going on here? Why didn't we notice that there's these weird errors hiding in plain sight that we should have picked up on? You'd hope that peer review would have picked up on those tells that something is not right with this evidence. So that might be part of the reason. I'm not entirely sure why social psychology, in particular, beyond those two big historical events, was there something about social psychology? Is there something about the social psychology that sort of prepared it to, start thinking about issues like pre-registration and how to address the credibility of our evidence? It's a really good question. I don't know what it might be about social psychology that sets it apart from other disciplines, or psychology that sets it apart from medicine, for example. But it is simply not true that the only discipline that's having replicability problems is psychology. Other disciplines are actively working on the very same problems that we are.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so Dr. Forscher, just before we go, would you like to tell people what are some of the best places on the internet for them to go there and know a little bit more about your work?
Yeah, the best place is probably Twitter. I'm at PS Forscher.
Mm-hmm. And there's not any other places, like, for example, I don't know, do you have your articles available somewhere or not?
Oh yeah, I post all my articles on an online preprint server called PsyArchive. It's another outcome of the replicability issues in psychology. The science reform movement is trying to make our research more open, so I believe very strongly in that. So if you want to read pretty much any of my papers, you can look me up, go to PsyArchive and download them.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very well. I will be leaving links to that in the description box of this video when it's out. So, Dr. Forscher, I would like to thank you again for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a real pleasure to have you on.
Oh, thank you very much. It's been fun.
Hi guys, thank you so much for watching this video until the end. I would also like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page and see if you can make a pledge there. I would really be thankful for that. And finally, I would also like to give a huge thank you to my patrons Karen Litzke, Anne Blanche, Per Helga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Chantal Gelinas and Jim Frank. Thank you a lot for all.